Thank you for joining the Tuesday afternoon session 9A. Hopefully you're in the right place. Session titled VMT, MOT, and a Diversion Study Walk into a Bar. I've been trying for the last week or two to come up with some sort of a follow-up to that, but it just the title just speaks for itself. We have three presentations that are all unique. I think they all have a component of innovative solutions and studies, and very much excited to learn more about the topics here. My name is Bastian Schroeder. I'm a principal engineer with Kittelson Associates in Wilmington, North Carolina. I have a photo of the Riverwalk here behind me. Unfortunately, not able to greet you all in person in Wilmington, but hoping that in 2024, I think when we're on the hook to be back here. So before we get started, we want to acknowledge all the meeting sponsors for the Southern District virtual meeting, but specific to this session, which is sponsored by NDS, Sam Hebb has joined us, and we'll hand it over to him for a few words from our sponsor.
Thank you, Bastian. So again, my name is Sam Hebb with NDS. We are a traffic data collection firm, so we serve kind of the east side of Southern District. So if you need traffic data collection in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, or Northern Alabama, please feel free to email me at sam@ndsa.com. If you need help in Lower Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, or a new office in Houston, Texas, please email gustavo@nds.com. So thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the session.
Thank you so much. So our first presentation is called Downtown South, South Saunders Traffic Diversions. The study presentation done jointly by Travis Fluitt, Tyler Farrell, and Sarah Wilson with Kimley-Horn. Travis has over 17 years of experience performing traffic studies for public and private sector developments, as well as NCDOT and municipal roadway projects all over North Carolina. He has worked on projects of every shape and size, from a 1,500 square foot coffee shop to 8,000 acre master plan development. Travis' favorite activity include traveling, eating in restaurants, and playing hockey, so COVID has worked out just great for him. Sarah Wilson is a transportation analyst with Kimley-Horn, where she has worked on many different types of projects over the past 2 years, including traffic analysis, signal timing, traffic safety, and traffic forecasting. She graduated from Georgia Tech and hopes to one day be able to safely visit Atlanta again to enjoy a favorite breakfast spot. Sarah may also be the quietest human on the planet, so be sure to turn up the volume on your speakers' headsets during her portion of the presentation. And last but not least, Tyler Farrell, who's a transportation analyst with Kimley-Horn, 3.5 years of experience, 2 of which he has unfortunately had to spend working on traffic studies with Travis. Tyler hails from the booming metropolis of LaBelle, Florida. You should Google it, apparently. And as a graduate of Florida State University, which you should also Google. I've never heard of it. As a Florida native, Tyler enjoys wrestling alligators, riding manatees, and being the subject of Florida Man headlines. So with that, I'm really excited to hand it over to Travis.
Thank you, Bastian. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the, I can't see my screen, hang on. The Downtown South development, which is the largest rezoning, at least in terms of traffic, in the city of Raleigh. And with that, there were some challenges that we ran into. So I'm going to talk about some of the methodology we used as part of that study, and some of the assumptions. So first of all, a little bit of intro to the project. Downtown South, where it's at is 3 tracks focused around the interchange of South Saunders Street and I-40 in Raleigh on the south side of downtown, hence the creative name Downtown South. So 3 tracks, A, B, and C. 39 parcels, 145 acres, and the rezoning would allow for up to 1,400 dwelling units, 75,000 square feet of retail space, over 10 million square feet of office space, and a soccer stadium. So for those of you familiar with Raleigh, think North Hills meets the Battery in Atlanta. So a very dense mixed-use development with an entertainment component added in, just for good measure. A little bit of context about the site. This is a shot from the Wake County Transit Plan, which is a very aggressive plan to add increased bus service and BRT through the area. So the downtown south development will have BRT along the eastern side of the property along Wilmington Street. I think that's planned for 2027, with hourly bus service along South Saunders Street running through the middle. Very well connected to the city of Raleigh's greenway system, so a lot of bike ped access. Raleigh has invested heavily in their greenway system, and it shows. So track C on the northeast corner is going to have the greenway running right through the middle of it, and that's something that will definitely be amenitized as part of this project and a focal point of the development. I'm not going to read through all this, but basically the city of Raleigh's comprehensive plan encourages development like this along the BRT corridors and along the greenway system. You know, dense, multi-use, bike ped, transit-friendly development to really get the most out of the investment in BRT and the greenway system that's already been made and will be made. So the challenge we faced with this development and this rezoning and the traffic study is that South Saunders Street is a major commuter route in and out of downtown Raleigh. 6-lane roadway with 44,000 vehicles a day, so approaching capacity, highly directional in the peak hours. But this development is going to add roughly 100,000. The rezoning allowed for about 100,000 new daily trips, most of which are going to use South Saunders Street. So our traditional, suburban methods of TIA assumptions, doing regular IT trip generation with minimal internal capture and mode sharing, and then the standard methodology of growing existing traffic counts up to a future year and then just dumping site traffic on top of that was just not going to work for a development of this magnitude and the transformative nature of this development in the city. So things we started looking at to combat this, trip generation, we looked at dense multi-use urban rates, really aggressive internal capture reductions, still a pretty modest bike ped transit reduction, but still not enough, not making a dent in the amount of traffic that we were facing. So then we started thinking about it another way, is what if this development displaces, we call it diversion, but I think a displacement's a better word, a lot of the existing traffic on South Saunders Street. And there's some evidence for this. Downtown Raleigh has seen significant growth over the last 15 to 20 years, where it was very heavy in office. Now we've added a lot of multifamily, added more restaurants, bars, nightlife. And as a result of that, traffic volumes, despite all this development, traffic volumes in and out of downtown Raleigh have remained relatively flat over the last 15 to 20 years. Some routes have actually gone down, some have only grown by about 1%. We also looked at the triangle regional model, and for track C, again, the northeast corner where the soccer stadium was going to be, looking at adding about 20,000 additional trips based on the model and what it was anticipating. But yet, when you look at where the traffic's going, this volumes on South Saunders Street only increased by about 3,000 vehicles a day, and none of the other adjacent streets increased by more than 1,000 vehicles a day. So why not more of an increase? Where is this traffic going? As a case study, we looked at a similar development. For those of you in Raleigh familiar with North Hills in North Raleigh, along Six Forks Road off of I-440, the west side of the development, what I call North Hills proper, is very commercial heavy, not very mixed use, a little bit of office, no real residential to speak of yet. And then the east side is primarily office and dense multifamily, but again, all very dense, walkable, and all this redevelopment's happened over the last 15 years. But what these charts show, which you obviously can't read because they're tiny, but that's not what's really important. You don't need to worry about the numbers. It's the trend lines that are important. On each of these charts, the green represents the projected volumes based on all the TIAs that were done for these developments. Orange is just a standard flat growth rate of 1% per year from 2000 up to 2017. And blue are the actual traffic volumes, the daily traffic volumes along Six Forks. And except for one spot, just right in front of the developments, the traffic on Six Forks has not grown or has actually gone down in some cases, despite all of this development. So what's going on? Well, we have a couple of theories about that. I think it's a combination of factors. One is a diversion of traffic to alternate routes, though in the case of North Hills, The traffic on adjacent parallel routes has really not increased either. So I think it's a combination of things, mode share, people now going to and from developments like North Hills instead of using Six Forks. And then, other people, just the friction that these developments have created on Six Forks cause fewer to make fewer trips to this area. It's like, I'm just not going to go around Six Forks at 5 in the afternoon. It's just too busy. So we were expecting the same thing to happen with Downtown South, but we need some data to back us up. So that's when we started looking at things like mode split. And I will turn it over to Tyler to take it from here.
Thanks, Travis. Yeah, just your local Florida man speaking here. So to get into the mode share kind of thing that we looked at, as Travis mentioned, that there was some challenges with the congestion that is already existing on South Saunders Street, and how we expect some of this displacement to happen is that it'll move to alternate modes. What we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of get a good data set of some other areas around the country about the mode split and how it's changed over time along their transit corridors, especially since the city is building the Southern Corridor BRT along Downtown South's front door. If you want to go to the next slide. So a couple of the locations that we looked at is Austin, and we looked at their Capital Metro Rapid bus line, Charlotte, the Lynx Blue line, which is light rail, and Cleveland, the Health Line corridor, which is BRT. The way we kind of went about this is we went and we got data, we got mode split data from the American Community Survey, which the U.S. Census puts out every year. I think they poll 3.5 million households or something like that every year, and it's updated, as I said a couple times already, it's updated every single year. So it represents a pretty good data set for pulling kind of mode split characteristics from. So we use the 1 year and 5 year data. Those are both of the kind of time frames that they provide. And we did it based on the commuting characteristics by sex, which just gives, I think, the best, at least the most robust data set for mode split percentages. So how we looked at it is we looked at the percent that's driving to work compared to just all the other modes of travel, including working from home because they're not making a trip. And we looked at the data from 2010 to 2018 where available. And we wanted to analyze it amongst a couple different settings because, as Travis kind of alluded to, Downtown South is a little bit separated from the urban core of downtown Raleigh. It's separated by about a mile. So what you'll see is setting criteria. We looked at the historic downtown core of all three of the locations listed above at the top of the slide. And then we looked all along those transit corridors, about a 1 mile segment extending out along that transit line from the historic downtown core to give a kind of apples to apples comparison to Downtown South. And then we just looked at the metropolitan statistical area for comparison purposes. So the Capital Metro Rapid bus line in Austin, just gonna give some characteristics. It's a high frequency bus route, provides 10-minute frequency service on the weekdays and 15 minutes on weekends. It doesn't have any level boarding and it operates in mixed traffic, and it began operation in January of 2014. So what you'll see here is just the census tracts that we pulled the data for the Capital Metro Rapid bus line. They obviously don't quite follow exactly each of these transit corridors, but they usually get close enough to where we can get good data. And the historic downtown Austin is kind of to the north in the image and then extending to the south. Go to the next screen. And so we'll have a couple of these charts for each of the locations, and the orange line is going to show the percent alternate. The percent alternate is on the y-axis and the years are on the x-axis, but the percent alternate for downtown Austin, as we would expect, is higher than kind of the transit corridor and the metropolitan statistical area, just due to the really good walkability and city blocks and stuff like that. But what you'll see is that along the corridor, the percent other mode of travel increased from 22% to 26% over a period of about 8 years. Go to the next slide. The next location we want to look at was Charlotte and their light rail. We liked Charlotte because it was a North Carolina comparison. So yeah, like I said, light rail, it has 7.5 minute frequency during the weekday peak hours and 15-minute frequency during non-peak hours, and it has level boarding. We really wanted to focus on the portion that extends from Uptown and the South End, because that's what we feel is a little bit, it feels like it's going to be more applicable to what we're looking at here, which is very dense development for downtown South. Kind of helps that it goes in the same direction, but that's just for kind of a joke. So we look at the census data the census blocks that we pull the data for the south, for the blue line. Again, extending about a mile from historic Uptown to the south. And you'll see about the same thing amongst all these graphs, but once again, you'll see that I probably should have labeled it Uptown, but Uptown Charlotte is, you know, the most percent other mode of transportation across the time period we analyzed, and the Lynx blue line increased from a certain point up about 7% over, am I reading this right? Yeah, 7% over about 8 years, and the MSA is roughly 10%. Go to the next slide. So the Cleveland Health Line. So the Cleveland Health Line is probably going to be the most applicable to downtown South since it is bus rapid transit. They provide 10-minute frequency. They have exclusive bus lanes, level boarding, and began operation in 2008. I think the Health Line probably has like all the bells and whistles that you kind of want with BRT, all of the amenities and stuff like that. So it's really high quality BRT service. And again, as the others, this is the census blocks that we pulled the data from, Cleveland being kind of to the left in the image and extending out to the east. So not sure what happened with the downtown line here, but we'll kind of focus on the Health Line corridor. And what you'll see is that it increased by about 13% over 8 years or so, percent other modes of travel. And the MSA again stays around 10%. So the general takeaways here is that as a transit corridor is built out, the percent other modes of transportation generally tends to increase, whereas the metropolitan statistical area stays at about 10% for all these locations, and downtown is just, it's more walkable. So if you go to the next slide. So yeah, so what we're kind of looking at here is, if we want to focus on those transit corridors, what we expect something similar to happen here for downtown South. We expect that some of the existing traffic that is currently utilizing South Saunders Street corridor using vehicles will, you know, displace and switch over to the BRT whenever it's been constructed. Not to mention that there's a lot of plans for intense mixed-use development along the corridor of South Saunders right now, and you can pretty much get to all of that planned mixed-use development with either the future BRT and the Greenway system. And we think that it's going to be a very bike ped friendly development in terms of trips. So now I will kick it over to Sarah to talk about Streetlight.
Awesome, thanks, Tyler. So like Tyler said, and Travis also emphasized this, South Saunders Street is already at capacity, and adding more trips would not be good for this roadway. You don't want to add more congestion to an already congested roadway. So one of the things that we thought to look at was to see where these trips might be going instead, so we could figure out if they weren't using South Saunders Street, where they would go off of South Saunders Street. So to look at this data, we use Streetlight to create origin destination matrices to show us where trips are starting from and where they're going to figure out where they could go instead. A little overview about Streetlight. I'm sure a lot of us have used it before for many different types of projects, but Streetlight uses smartphone and Bluetooth data to create origin destination matrices, and it's to show you where it goes on their digital road network. Streetlight uses an algorithm to create this data and give you where your trips are going to start and end. You can get a lot of different types of data from Streetlight, including ADT data, turning movement counts. You can get bike and ped data. They also released a transit function now, so I think that's super exciting, and I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes. But for our purposes, we were really focusing on their origin destination functionality. So some methodology that we were using for this project were 3 simple steps: create the zones, create the analysis, and then look at the analysis to figure out what we can do with it. The zones we created were an internal zone and an external zone, and I'll dive a little bit more into what each of those looked like for us. All right, so for the internal zone, we specifically we're looking at a cut-through analysis. So our internal zone, we wanted to say, like, this is the zone that everyone is passing through our gate on South Saunders Street. They're going through downtown Raleigh to get somewhere outside of downtown. And the reason we thought that was important was to say, if you're using South Saunders Street to cut through downtown to get somewhere that's not downtown, there are much better routes that you can take if South Saunders Street is so congested. So you can see we have two kind of outlines here, and the inner one is our downtown zone, and that's closer into downtown Raleigh. We used a 1.5 mile buffer south of 440, which is kind of the outer belt line around Raleigh, and on the south of Raleigh is I-40, which creates the southern portion of the loop around Raleigh. We used a little bit shorter of a distance on the southern portion just because you can see the heart of downtown is a little bit closer to the south, and also our site is on the southern side. So we used about 4,000 feet on the south, and you kind of see what kind of shape that created for our cut through zone. Awesome. So once we had our cut through zone, we need to see if they're cutting through downtown, where are they going to? And so for those gates, we used our external gates. You can see the star represents our gate on South Saunders Street, and then all of these other red pins represent our external gates. There are about 9 gates, 10 because there's 2 on one of the roads. But each of these are just the major corridors that are entering and exiting downtown. We chose the major ones instead of choosing every single path because you can see there are a bunch of different ways that people can get into and out of downtown, but we felt like if you're cutting through, these are the most likely routes that you're going to take. So anything that ends up at any of these red gates passes through that internal zone from the gold star is what we're counting as cut through for our purposes. Awesome. So once we did our cut through analysis and we're able to download data, this is what it looked like. You can see the blue dots represent each one of our external gates, and they vary by size depending on how much cut through traffic we were able to count at that gate. So you can see up on that northeast side, that's Capitol Boulevard. And if you are familiar with Raleigh, Capitol Boulevard is basically 6 to 8 lanes, massive highway-like in certain areas. People go flying through there. And so to us, this shows that a lot of people are passing through an area near our proposed development and passing through downtown and going up Capitol Boulevard to get somewhere north of Raleigh. Based on this, we think there might be a better way for them to get there. So this is part of what we looked at as well after we did our cut-through analysis, was looking at what other routes can people use instead of using South Saunders Street once it is over capacity. So for this analysis, we are looking at RTP. A lot of residential areas are located south of South Saunders Street, down US 70 and US 401, which is kind of on that southern side where all the lines are going to. And then up in the northwest corner, west of Raleigh, is RTP, which, if you're familiar with Raleigh, RTP is Research Triangle Park, and there is a lot of employment there. A lot of tech companies have offices there. The airport's in that area. It's really just a lot going on that people might be using South Saunders Street as a cut through to get to I-40 as commuting traffic. However, there is a proposal to extend I-540 south of where it currently ends, which is a little bit outside of this map, but essentially based on the locations in the south end, we thought 540 might be a good alternative route for them to take. Also, Tryon Road runs south of I-40, but parallel to it. So we felt like if South Saunders Street is super over capacity, Tryon Road could be another good use of that same movement without adding to South Saunders Street. So for this, we were doing the same thing. We were looking at where else can cars divert, and looking at this, we wanted to see, like, using South Saunders Street, where are they going once they get up to South Saunders Street from a southern location on US 401. You can see most of the traffic is going through, about 14% was going up through downtown. We already established some of that might be cut through traffic, but there is a good 2% that's going to the west, and we were looking at it and we were thinking maybe Tryon Road is good to use as an alternative route if you're going to the west, or Hammond Road, which is just east of South Saunders Street, and also goes into downtown and also has access to I-40. Since we were looking at with this one. And with this one, we were doing the same thing, only coming from US 70. US 70 is a little bit further west than US 401, and we thought that You can use I-40 if you're going from here. You can also use Hammond Road that I mentioned previously. You can use a couple of different methods. And so with this, we're just trying to look at where else can people divert. Awesome. So as I mentioned, South Saunders Street is very over capacity. However, the adjacent road, Hammond Road, that I was talking about with US 70 is currently under capacity and is also very well served by I-40. And so we felt like that was a good alternative route for those coming up US 70. And now I'm going to pass it back over to Travis, who can tell you what they decided to do with this information.
Thank you, Sarah and Tyler. And I'll just wrap up briefly. Sebastian doesn't yell at me. But as part of the rezoning TIA, where we ended up was predicting about a 30% traffic shift on South Saunders on the north side of 40 and a 5% traffic shift off of South Saunders, south of I-40, excuse me. We definitely got some pushback from DOT and the city of Raleigh on this. The big question was, well, where is this traffic going to go? But as I mentioned with North Hills, I'm not sure that some of it will definitely be relocated to alternate routes, but I think a lot of it will also be mode shift, as we've seen with other corridors in Charlotte and Austin and Cleveland when we add the BRT. I think traffic will, as we've seen in the model, I think traffic is now going to be going to and from downtown south instead of to downtown or other developments. And then finally, people are just going to avoid this area because of congestion. And, if they're at home, they're going to make a trip, either not make the trip or go somewhere else. Next steps, we're actually now in the process of doing the traffic study for Track C, which is the northeast tract. We're probably not going to look at it as a significant a diversion just because we're not adding as much traffic to the network as we were during the rezoning. And we're going to run the analysis with and without this diversion and see what difference it makes on the recommendations. But the good news is that the city has asked us that we update this TIA every 5 years. So hopefully in 5 years from now, we'll be able to thumb our noses at the city and DOT and say, hey, we were right, but we'll see you in 2026 and report back on the results. I'll turn it back over to Bastian.
All right, well, thank you all for the presentation. And if anyone in the audience does have questions, please send them with the question pod. I'll start with one question. It's an interesting development and really a mega development, and your findings kind of make intuitive sense for something really of that scale of magnitude. Based on your experience, do you have a sense of kind of what is the threshold? At what level of development are you really seeing these significant diversion impact, just drastic changes in traffic? Or in other words, at what point, at what size development do you really have to take the IT trip generation manual and kind of throw it out the window and try something else?
That's a good question. We certainly expect to see it with Track C as it develops. The current plan for Track C is nowhere near what was in the zoning, but it's still proposing about over 2 million square feet of office, about 2,000 residential units, a good bit of retail, and then eventually the soccer stadium. So it's going to be a gradual 10-year build out. So it's not going to be day one. The BRT is supposed to happen in 2027. So my thought is that once you get up in that 2 million square feet of office range is when we're going to really start seeing that, probably 5+ years from now and when the BRT comes online. But it's all about context. If this were out in the suburbs, this would be a totally different conversation because we wouldn't have access to the BRT and the greenway and all the other amenities that they're going to get from this.
Great, thank you. So we don't have any other questions at this point. So I'll again, thank you for your presentation. We might have some time for questions towards the end of the presentation. But in the interest of time, we'll move over to our next presenters, Mike Schmitt and Tim Paget, also from Kimley-Horn, talking about a VMT study, vehicle miles travel study out of California. So Mike Schmitt has nearly 30 years of experience and has worked on a wide variety of multimodal transportation projects, including those with a significant focus on VMT. He's currently responsible for developing VMT-based transportation policies for multiple northern and southern California jurisdictions. Mike's broader technical expertise includes multimodal planning, modeling, land use planning, GIS, traffic operations, safety, public involvement, research. And then Tim Padgett is the senior leader in Kimley-Horn's travel forecasting group at Raleigh. His practice is focused on travel demand forecasting using models, innovative tools, big data, and non-traditional thinking to support planning efforts across the country. Tim has over 25 years of experience, including time with Kimley-Horn as well as the NCDOT. In that time, Tim has worked on forecasting and modeling projects in over a dozen states throughout the country. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mike, and I look forward to the presentation. VMT-based analysis is certainly a very different way of looking at things compared to what we're used to in the Southern District. So take it away.
Thanks, Bastian. So I've worked with Mike for a long time. You know, I'm a more traditional travel demand modeler. I think that Mike is a reluctant travel demand modeler. He does it, but he does a lot of other things too. And he brought me in on this project and kind of threw me into the deep end, pulling some of these numbers from travel demand models and really getting pretty far down in the weeds. And the thing that jumped out at me as we started looking at this, or as I started looking at this, is that you know, from a modeling perspective, you know, this was really interesting stuff, but I never really saw the big picture. And so as I kind of stepped back and looked at a broader perspective, you know, some you know, greater detail started to emerge. And so what Mike's going to do is Mike's going to go through kind of the bigger picture of this. He's going to talk about, you know, VMT in general, what's going on with it in California, the need for this in California, you know, why they're doing it, some overview of how it's done and some thresholds, examples to show you how it works. And then, you know, what about level of service? How does it work with VMT? And then some mitigation strategies. And then finally, I'll come back with some takeaways and some things that I've seen from my perspective outside of California. So Mike, all yours.
Thanks, Sam. So what is VMT? Just as a refresher. So VMT is simply vehicle miles traveled. So as this graphic shows, it's a fairly simple calculation. Basically, you just take the number of vehicles, you calculate the distance they're covering, and you get a VMT. So in this example, it's 4 vehicles times 3 miles, 12 VMT. Nice and easy. So level of service is something near and dear to my heart. I started my career out working in Tucson on the HCM 2000, and some of you might remember the picture up there on the side if you're a little older, the metric units version of the HCM. So if you've got a copy of that, I encourage you to hold on to it because it's going to be a collector's edition someday. But the HCM has been around for, you know, darn near 70 years plus, and you know, there's been 6 editions. You know, it's really significantly guided transportation decision making over that period. But with 70 years of experience, we've also learned some things about it. Under some circumstances, it doesn't always give us the best outcomes. Sometimes it encourages urban sprawl. You know, there can be negative impacts to active transportation. If you think about what happens at an intersection, often it results in widening, and with widening, that negatively impacts pedestrian and bicycle activity at the location. And also, we're finding this phenomenon called induced demand, which is basically the idea that there's some trips that are suppressed because of congestion, and as we add more capacity, some of those suppressed trips suddenly appear that weren't there before, in addition to new trips. But VMT analysis, we're finding is sensitive to these challenges. So we're finding this is a new tool in the toolbox to kind of start to address this. But again, level of service, we know a lot about we have a lot of experience with understanding the outcomes. VMT, we're still learning. So another area that really underscores the need for VMT analysis is air quality and greenhouse gases. VMT has a very strong correlation to greenhouse gas emissions. And this graphic kind of shows that relationship. And, you know, and the experience has been in California is, you know, we started to implement policies and programs to start managing greenhouse gases, you know, quite a while ago. And we started to get probably pretty excited, you know, in the early, you know, 2005, things started to get better. We were probably feeling pretty good about where we were headed. But then we realized it was really the economy. The recession suppressed VMT, it suppressed greenhouse gases. And as the economy started to recover, well, it started to ramp back up. And we've got some pretty ambitious goals in California to reduce that. And we're not being as successful as we want to. So we need new tools to help us get there. And that's part of this where we're going. So VMT analysis, you know, in California, it's a response to environmental law. We handle some of our transportation stuff under a program called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. but it's basically how we determine if there's a transportation significant impact. And this was a big change for us from moving from a level of service as the primary indicator to VMT. And this broader attempt with VMT was also an effort to promote sustainability and greenhouse reduction by promoting denser infill development, reducing single occupancy vehicles, and promoting mass transit. And even though some agencies in California started to implement this earlier, every agency in the state of California was required by July 1st to make this a part of their environmental analysis. So how do we handle this? So we'll start getting into the kind of nuts and bolts of how this works. So I'm first going to kind of touch on thresholds. So basically what you do when you have a project come in is before we analyze the project, we pre-calculated an area or region and said, okay, here's the average VMT per capita, or here's the average VMT per employee. And then we set the threshold and said, okay, we're going to meet our goals with sustainability of greenhouse gases, we've set a goal of having residential and new employment projects be 15% less than average. So pretty aggressive. So a new project comes in, often we take a travel demand model, we do the calculations in that traffic analysis zone, and we make a determination how it measures against the larger region. And that's how we handle residential employment. Retail and some of the other uses are handled a little differently. We use what's called a net increase in total VMT. But with I'll cover that in a few minutes, how that works. And transportation, likewise, we also analyze transportation facilities and we look at a net increase. There are some examples we've got several exemptions that are the basis for not undertaking more detailed analysis, which include smaller projects, so projects with less than 110 trips per day, projects that are transit-oriented development in nature, that's something we're trying to promote and reduces VMT. Local retail, I'll talk about that in a minute. Affordable infill housing, we recognize that lower income populations typically locate closer to their employment, and they also make less discretionary trips, so often they're a lower VMT producing. And then we allow for what we call map-based screening, which is basically we just predetermine areas of high and low VMT, and it's reasonable to assume as new development comes in those areas, it's going to mimic those patterns. So one of the more challenging parts about VMT analysis is just this realization of induced demand, and this improvements can be impacts, and this has been one of the more challenging, kind of almost overwhelming aspects of this. Land use has been a little easier to work out. Transportation improvements we're still working on in California, frankly, to kind of resolve, because what happens is basically anytime you have a capacity enhancing project, a widening, well, induced demand kicks in and VMT goes up. I think across the United States, we're starting to recognize increasingly that, it's getting harder and harder to build our way out of it by widening projects. And that's part of what I think there's been acknowledgement with this act in California. So this slide shows various types of projects we've analyzed, personally analyzed it in California. And while there are established methods for a lot of these uses, and so they're very easy, like residential, retail, office, we use a travel demand model. And once again, I'll give an example to kind of show how it works. VMT is kind of an interesting animal in that it becomes a little bit of a thinking game as you get into some more complex projects, because you're trying to figure out, what is the change in VMT and what's the threshold I'm measuring that against. And it's kind of easy to look at residential projects or retail projects or office. It starts to get more complicated when you consider things like a winery, or I had an amusement park, a cemetery. There's all these other land uses that come about that need analysis, and you have to basically, it becomes a challenge to figure out how to measure that and what the threshold is. In terms of analysis, the travel demand model is really the gold standard for analyzing VMT. There's some nuances to do with it because of truncation with travel demand models, but really that's kind of become the gold standard. But the more we've gotten into it, the more we've learned we also need to bring other tools to bear, kind of thing, routing and logistics, GIS, sketch planning tools. I'm going to talk about that in a moment too. One of the interesting areas where we're really seeing a lot of growth or real interest is big data. And I think, Sarah mentioned street lighting. Street lights has gotten really into that market in California and probably across the US now to really try to help show how VMT changes by different land use categories. There's other folks that are on also working on that. For instance, there's some analytic companies that also do big data, like Replica, that's also working on this kind of thing. And then we've also had situations where we have to sometimes use qualitative methods, and I've got a great example of that in a minute too. Just on this slide, this is just continuing talking about tools. One of the things that we've learned about VMT, and this is somewhat true about all models, but we don't often have to think about it. But if you take a couple different models and ask them to do analysis, well, they can often give you different absolute values. So what's really important in this type of analysis is whatever you set the threshold in, you also need to do the analysis in. And this is a slide from a UC Davis study where they kind of said, okay, let's look at 3 different sketch planning tools to analyze land use and VMT, and you can see they're kind of all over the place. And so the lesson was like, hey, you got to be really careful about this topic. You can't analyze VMT in software A and then make the threshold in software B. A has to be both threshold and analysis, VMT analysis. So now I'm going to kind of shift in examples and kind of show you how does this really work, kind of thing. So I've got 2 project examples I'm going to show you to kind of. And what the takeaway I really want you to capture from the next 2 examples is that the outcomes are very different than if we just did level of service. And that's by design. I mean, the idea of VMT is to kind of resolve some of those challenges we see on a larger planning level that comes out of just exclusively using level of service. So my first example, we're just going to take 1,000 single-family residents. This is a project that I was involved with in the rural Valley Central Madera County, if you're familiar at all with California. It's in the typical suburban rural context. So just kind of think of it's kind of this typical urban sprawl where, bigger residential developments kind of locate further and further out just by virtue of land availability and all the other reasons. It happens all over the US. And the primary tool we used was the travel demand model, like I said, kind of the gold standard for this type of analysis. So how do we do this? So this is a homogeneous single family residential project. What we basically do is we take the travel demand model and we say, okay, well, travel demand models tell us about different trip purposes. So we take residential and it's somewhat complex, but this is a simplification, but basically there's home-based work trips, there's home-based school trips, there's home-based shopping trips. And we're able to discern that from the travel demand model to estimate those. So, I'm showing a single home in this example, but really you got to think about this being a larger aggregate. So, we add up all the trips that are made and we calculate the distance from the skims and we get an amount. So you can see up here, there's 50 VMT. And then we divide through by the number of people. And like I said, I'm kind of cheating and saying we're just looking at a single household, which we'd never do, but we divide by the number of people and then we get a value. So this is the VMT per capita in this example is 16.7 miles per capita per individual. And then we have previously, like I said, we take the average for the region and we said, okay, we're going to go 15% below that. So this one would be over that threshold. So this is an indication that we would want this development they're having a significant impact. We would want them to try to figure out ways to mitigate VMT. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. But kind of back to our example, let's take a step back. So on the left, I've kind of cheated and I didn't put all the level of service information up, and I've kind of grabbed Google Maps, and Google Maps kind of shows, it's all green out there, and that's really what the level of service found. This is, kind of a suburban context, a little further out. There's capacity, and if there wasn't, it's easily fixed with level of service. On the right, it's a visual depiction of VMT, and this is one of the neat ways if you ever have to show VMT to folks, is width of line and length of line from a travel demand model, and you can see what happens is from the site, it kind of emanates out. It gets less as it moves out further. So in the old world, level service world, this was an easy, great project. In a VMT world, it's a very different outcome. And that leads to what we would call a VMT impact. So we would be looking at these folks to say, is this really a great project, and or how are you going to mitigate this? How are you going to reduce your VMT impact? So the second example I'm going to move on to is retail. And retail is one of my favorite ones to talk about because retail, and this was one of the big aha moments for us, is retail is a real beneficiary of VMT. In the level of service world, VMT has a pretty big challenge. Often, new commercial developments have a very difficult time with local congestion problems and level of service issues. But from a VMT standpoint, they're actually do very well. So in this example, I'm going to talk about a 12,000 square foot retail store in a very urban context. And we used qualitative measures, and you'll see why that makes sense in a minute. And it was in Northern California. So this shows you how we think about VMT and what the research has kind of taught us about commercial, like smaller commercial developments. Think a grocery store, a Walgreens, a drugstore. These are trips you have to make. They're necessities, essentially. So what you can see is on the left, those two homes out kind of off center are traveling further to get to the store. But we introduce a new store and it shortens the trip. And that's really what we kind of find is as you put more retail, like basic retail kind of stuff, local serving retail in the urban fabric, well, it has a way of reducing trip lengths actually. And so in a weird way, even though we all kind of think of the immediate areas, the LOS, being congested and stuff like that, it kind of has a way of almost reducing congestion further out because folks are making shorter trips. So the way we measure that is we say, okay, we're going to take all the VMT for an area, and let's say it's 5 million vehicle miles per an area. And this little change actually causes a net reduction. So from a VMT standpoint, this is a good thing. This is something that we're trying to promote. So this, just to kind of follow on that example, like I said, it was an urban area. It's all reds and oranges on the Google cheat that I'm doing. Level of service was terrible. Caltrans hates this location. And on the right, you can see the VMT really. You can see that all these black dots show where the other stores are. The red dot shows where the new one is, and it kind of fills in a blank. So folks that are closer to it are going to change their trip patterns and shorten their VMT. So it's not a VMT impact. So very different outcomes. So that you can see once again, the residential showed us that, which we're all concerned about to some extent, is urban sprawl. And at the same time, this is helpful to encouraging infill development. So what are we finding out as we get further into this experiment in California, I guess if you want to call it that, is we're finding that it's giving very counter different results in level of service. And that was by design. That's what was trying to be accomplished by introducing this. So you can see, level of service, what we all know in urban areas, it's hard, it's congested, it's difficult to mitigate. VMT, meanwhile, shorter trips, it's a good indicator that says this is a good place for us to put, it encourages infill development. LOS, the rural areas, encourages urban sprawl. Meanwhile, that's less the case with VMT. And you can see retail kind of across the board wins in VMT world, but roadway widening is this other animal. You can kind of see that level of service does better with it. VMT not so much. So VMT does provide a valuable counterbalance to LOS. I just want to speak to the fact that level of service isn't dead. I think, maybe early on we were all wondering how are we going to deal with LOS, and what we've kind of found is they're almost complementary measures in some way. Like I said, VMT can help offset some of those concerns that LOS can encourage. LOS is still an important metric in most locales. They handle it through a different mechanism than they maybe handled in the past. We still use it to focus on things like site access and as a proxy for safety, congestion management programs. But what I'm also seeing though is there's kind of been a rise of the other metrics. As level of service has maybe lost a little bit of its importance, the VMT's gained some of it. Now other metrics are starting to become more important too. It's safety, travel time reliability, air quality, throughput. And in some ways, I think it's showing encouraging early signs that may help us build a more balanced transportation system. So I think there's reasons to be early on encouraged, but there's definitely some challenges that are developing. And one of the big challenges we're still struggling with is mitigation. We all know how to mitigate level of service, but it's far more challenging to mitigate VMT. And one of the big mechanisms we currently use is what we call transportation demand measures, and TDMs. And that's all these, neat things like van pools and guaranteed rides and, things of that nature. But, those are difficult to implement. They're difficult to monitor. And frankly, we haven't spent a lot of money on, we spent tons of money in the national academies on researching highway capacity manual, understanding congestion. Don't really have that body of evidence with transportation demand measures. So we're kind of playing catch up on that across the US to understand that. What we're starting to realize the better solution is more infrastructure type projects. So there's kind of a movement towards the idea of similar to impact fees is you're going to buy into programs that have bicycle or transit or pedestrian improvements at their core because those reduce VMT. So we're starting to kind of maybe move in a direction more like that. And developers like that because it's predictable. I write a check for a certain amount of mitigation to a VMT bank or exchange or fee program. and that helps me resolve. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tim to give you some takeaways from today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, I was brought in pretty far down in the weeds of this in the travel demand model, and the weeds were hard. This analysis isn't super easy. Pulling these things from the model, you find out pretty quickly that every situation is different. You find out that every project is different. You find out that every tool is different, and you find out that every travel demand model is different and how you have to go about getting this information. But, stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, and Mike mentioned this too, I think we all understand that the days of building our way out of congestion are probably done, if not done already. We build new roads and we increase the amount of traffic, right? I think that we all understand that there's an inherent connection between land use and transportation. And so, looking at this, I kept going back to Mike's second example, the urban infill. And, just looking at that and seeing that how we do things now, if I want to build something, if I want to build a grocery store that's closer to residential, but it's in a congested area, I'm going to do the analysis currently, and it's going to be bad, right? But looking at VMT actually makes it a good thing, right? Because you're actually reducing the amount of travel that people are doing in terms of vehicle miles traveled. But our current policy doesn't really have a way to show that as a benefit. It's not something that's taken into account. And so I know that California implemented this as part of their environmental policy. And where this goes outside of California, I don't know. I don't know if this is something that will kind of catch on and grow and states and areas will implement, or if it will be something that is just a California thing. I know from my perspective that while I'm still learning and they're still learning, and we're all still figuring things out as we go about this, I think the bottom line is it's changing outcomes in California, right? It's changing land use planning. It's changing decisions. And it's, we've been doing things pretty much the exact same way in our industry for basically forever. And, looking at another metric, pulling VMT in, this allows us to take a look at something that we haven't before. I think it's time we looked at these other things that we, I don't know the words that Mike used, but that we have a more holistic, hopefully, transportation system going forward. And I, for one, I'm excited for where this is going to go. So with that, Bastian, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you so much. Fascinating topic, and it turns out much more closely related to really the first presentation than maybe our session title suggests, right? So, can't help but think that a development like South Front, we have the South Saunders development, that the impact on VMT would look very different than looking at the traditional level of service. If you have questions, please go ahead and submit them. I'll start off with one. You kind of alluded to the Highway Capacity Manual, which is a group, the Highway Capacity Committee, that I've been very active with for many years. And I'm kind of curious, Mike, maybe in your thoughts on what is needed. You talked about the qualitative assessment of the retail. What would you look for, in terms of national guidance, state guidance, or methods to really help support an analysis like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, we've learned that I think early on we were all like, oh, this is going to be fast, easy, and cheap. That's how I think VMT was first presented. And we couldn't quickly realize, okay, well, it's none of those things. It's a little more complicated. But at the same time, I think there is the opportunity. It would be kind of a parallel course with the HCM. I think there's this opportunity to still keep the good parts of LOS because we need safe, efficient transportation system. But there's also the opportunity for us to better talk about the land use that's underlying it. And I think the guidance, you know, and we're starting to get better at this in California. Lots of agencies are writing very specific guidance, but you just need to take the time to deal with the different land use categories, talk about the analysis technique you want, set a threshold, and then set a policy about what you expect that outcome to lead to. So, you know, I think it can be tailored to a lot of different jurisdictions, that not everyone has to follow the California model, but the basic ideas and principles and best practices, I think, can be implemented in a lot of places to improve decision making.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. We do have a question or maybe a comment along the lines that not all VMTs are the same as far as CO2 emissions go and their impact. Any thoughts from you on you know, how to maybe break apart the VMT impacts based on their environmental and other impacts?
That's a great comment, because VMT is not all VMT is created equally, and that's a great point. So, you know, a lot of times we still do air quality analysis afterwards to kind of confirm it, because it's true when you look at greenhouse gas emissions in particular, low speed greenhouse gas emissions and higher speeds do better or do worse than the kind of that middle strip. There's like this 30 to 60 mile per hour thing. We're kind of in that great range in terms of emissions. But, you know, the research still kind of looks at this when it's looked at this question, and there's been a lot of debate back and forth. In terms of finding a whole kind of a holistic metric, VMT still does a pretty good job at that. But that is a fair comment, that sometimes you need to qualify the quality, but sometimes we look at another metric, which is called congested VMT. So sometimes we look at the network and we say, if you're on we quantify how much of the VMT is on volume to capacity ratio is greater than 1. So how much of this VMT is on solidly congested areas? So good comment, and that's something we're very cognizant of and trying to further incorporate.
Great. We got one more question that just came in. Could a local agency, such as a medium-sized city, implement VMT, or would it have to be more regional? Seems like it needs to be regional to incorporate trips outside of the city limits.
So we've seen both models kind of develop. Some larger counties maybe have kind of collectively come with cities and said, okay, we're going to work together and create a policy. But we've also seen smaller cities do it, you know, and I've seen them both be successful. So there is the opportunity for a smaller city to kind of say, hey, we've got a regional model. Here's our expectations for what you're going to pull out of that model. And here's our thresholds. And here's what we expect to do with that, some type of mitigation or help us address it. Or at least it can even just be an informational piece for decision makers as they look at a project. Because, you know, we keep going back to that example about the retail, but it would be helpful to kind of offset that concern about the congestion with, hey, let's look at the bigger picture. This is actually shortening trips, so further out, it's maybe reducing congestion, and we lose that in the conversation today with level of service.
Okay, that sounds great. So we have one last question here. So neighborhood schools and scale-appropriate grocery retail will prosper in California based on VMT policy? Comment or question?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You know, a lot of anything that's local serving or has a high customer base, and we're moving it closer to where this trip start, is benefiting from that. And it's been a good thing, because I think it's going to overall reduce congestion, you know, and at the same time, it's also a mechanism for dealing with urban sprawl. But I think the short answer is, yeah, absolutely, that's been the case.
Yeah, I guess then I have a follow-up on that. So how do you know, I'll take a grocery store. I mean, you have small specialty store, you have the more common chains, and then you have the big box, you know, kind of membership-driven clubs. It seems like they have a very different, you know, kind of customer group and regional impact. Is there any guidance out there on a, you know, Harris Teeter versus Sam's Club or Costco?
Yeah, that's a great point. So we typically we have two categories of retail. We have local serving, which is these grocery stores, Walgreens, these smaller things, and then we have regional retail. And so with regional retail, we typically ask you to like do a little more work to basically show that it's kind of thing. But a lot of times it's kind of funny. It has the same outcome. If you think about a Costco, where you have Costco spread all over the place, sometimes it's almost like a Costco desert, and you fill in a Costco and it has the same effect of shortening the VMT. So it has the same effect, but we do make a distinction. Anything greater than 50,000 square feet per store, we call it regional retail, and we get into a little higher level of analysis to make sure we understand how it's performing. But it doesn't get that quick pass that the smaller stuff does.
Okay, great. Well, really appreciate all your questions. We're going to go ahead and move on to the last presenter here. And so we're going to shift gears here a little bit. We're going to hear about innovative traffic solutions for MOT, maintenance of traffic. Hearing from Richard Odynski, who is a senior traffic engineer for WSP with 14 years of experience in roadway design and traffic control design. Richard has worked in a wide range of complex projects throughout North Carolina over the last 8 years with WSP. In addition to North Carolina, Richard has worked as the lead traffic control engineer for projects throughout the Southeast, New York, Washington, Texas. When not working, Richard enjoys spending time with his wife, 2 kids, and 2 dogs. So with that, I'll hand it over to Richard.
Thank you, Bastian. Yeah, again, just to follow up on that, mostly North Carolina work all throughout the Southeast and some spot projects across the country have really provided a lot of good background for the MOT leads and just different projects and different needs for maintaining traffic as we go. So just a quick agenda. We're going to go through just kind of some goals or principles as we first start looking at MOT, facility type, location, urban versus rural, how that ties into what the different goals are. And then we're just going to go through some project highlights that we've worked on over the last 8 years and some kind of innovative approaches and things that we've done to help maintain traffic or operations while building some complex projects. So again, just some of the goals. Obviously, safety is always first and foremost for MOT or traffic control. Dealing with construction, we want the public, pedestrians, bicyclists, transit users. Everybody using the facility needs to be safe. But again, workers, government agencies, inspectors, the folks out on the project site as well. It's a big deal for them to be safe as well. The next few bullets are kind of depend on the project and depend on the location, what order you put those in. Design builds probably have contractors pushing schedule and cost a lot higher up on the list. But obviously, again, the goal is to keep traffic flowing, keep people safe, keep driveways and parcels open, and if you have sidewalks or bike facilities or transit facilities, keeping them working and going as you build the project. But one thing that I think gets lost sometimes is that doesn't mean everything has to stay the way it is today. Maintaining operations doesn't mean the intersection functions exactly like it does. It just means making sure that you're not significantly increasing congestion or taking travel lanes away while you're trying to build a project. And it doesn't have to be temporary either. A lot of good optimizations or some things we've done on projects has actually been working with bridge design or roadway design folks and doing permanent changes to the design to relocate something or move something that helps with constructability or schedule. So again, just something to remember as you look at traffic control is just because you're dealing with temporary situations doesn't mean sometimes the best solution isn't a temporary change. So a few of the projects we're going to look at today, again, all in North Carolina. The green highlighted ones are design build projects, and the blue are your typical bid build ones. The first number naming convention is just NCDOT's conventional STIP numbers. So you'll hear me refer to those a lot throughout the presentation, and that's just kind of the project number here in North Carolina. So the first project we're going to look at is R2828. It was actually an NCTA, a toll authority or a turnpike authority express lane project. The project was actually for a new facility, NC 540, but the main focus of the project I'm going to look at today is the existing I-40 US 70 bypass interchange. You can see on the left, it's a trumpet intersection. I-40 is running actually north-south here at this location, although both US 70 and I-40 are east-west designations. So I'll try to follow along with the pictures for north-south references just so it's a little easier to follow. Then the picture on the right shows our proposed design where our team won the project with. It's a kind of a quasi-turbine. It does have 2 loops still left in the middle. And you can kind of see where the opening in the trees on the bottom right quadrant is kind of where the existing US 70 flyovers come through. And then where the new 540 bridges over I-40 are is pretty much almost right where the existing flyovers are, just to kind of give you a reference point of what that looked like on top of each other. And you can kind of see it there on the image on the right underneath, a little bit light there. But a few of the challenges on the project is we actually had another design build project that was awarded a few months before our project. It was the I-5111 project, and that was widening of I-40, and it was pretty much a couple miles on either side of our project, with our project, really right in the middle of theirs. And so that created some conflicts or issues where we needed to work through traffic shift patterns, work schedules, and just work areas in general to make sure that we weren't in the way of the I-5111 team or vice versa. So that way everyone could get where they needed to, traffic was where they needed to be, and we didn't have conflicting work areas going on. We had a major earthwork move that needed to cross I-40. Is about 1 million cubic yards of dirt. So that was an issue. We needed to figure out a safe, efficient way to get that earthwork across I-40. We had about 7 bridges within a mile. You can see the 6 on the screen, and then one just north of where the screen cuts off. And then the blue stars just represent all of the ramp conflicts between some of the existing and proposed movements that we had to try to work around to get the new turbine built. So the first phase, you can see the green is going to represent the existing traffic or the current traffic pattern for each phase, and then the blue is kind of what we're building in each phase. And the main focus here was we wanted to get the westbound I-40, or in this case, the way it's rotated northbound, I-40 ramps moved onto the new turbine ramps to get them kind of out of the middle of the turbine area. But the other main focus was that the I-5111 team was actually shifting to the median first and doing their outside widening along I-40. And what we needed to do is be able to get our median piers for those 7 bridges constructed before they got into the median to do their work zone for the new pavement, median barrier drainage, all the typical roadway components. And so what we ended up doing is working with our structure design leads to get our median piers, our substructure plans approved actually before the rest of the bridge plans. And that let us accelerate that bridge construction, or at least the median piers, for all 7 of those bridges while traffic is in the pattern you see on the typical section below. So it was a little more narrow than the contractor would have preferred. Typically we would have shifted traffic towards the outside to do that work. But I think it was 25 or 26 feet. So it was enough for them to get the equipment and the material in there and do it. And again, it eliminated this conflict for the typical section there, where if the I-5111 team is trying to do grading and paving and our team is trying to have cranes and material and building piers, that just wasn't going to work out well for anyone. So we were able to get in there early, get those built, and get out of the way before that became a conflict. So in the next phase, again, the I-40 westbound ramps were moved onto the new turbine, again shown in green, and that let us build the 3 southern bridges to the bottom of the turbine there in the blue. And really the big benefit for that was the middle bridge there. We actually over-designed to accommodate off-road earthwork hauling trucks. So reinforce the bridge deck, the substructure, everything that needs to go in to make sure that those typical off-road vehicles would be able to use that to move that dirt that we needed to move. And then the other things to point out are the red temp pavement you see there. Once traffic crossed over the I-40 bridge, the northern one of the 3 in that group, we actually crossed them over to the outer loop or the outer turbine ramp, and then back kind of split to the existing ramps on the northwest quadrant of the interchange to go back to the existing ramps and ultimately tie back to I-40. You can kind of see that pattern here. They come from the east, cross over the bridge over I-40 at the red star, and you can see the typical section we had for that. So basically one direction of traffic is actually going the wrong way of the ramp, the final ramp configuration. And they follow along, and then eventually where we built those temp pavements, they cross over to the turbine and then tied back down to the existing ramps. But what that did is got all of our ramps now either on new ramp pavement or at least outside of the full turbine footprint, and that has allowed us to kind of finish all of the movements that we needed to for the turbine. That got us to be able to shift traffic basically to the final pattern, and then just do some finishing work, demoing that temp pavement and just kind of getting everything to its official final pattern. So again, the accelerated median piers really helped us with just overall schedule, and then also eliminated that conflict with would have been contractors just in each other's way trying to build their improvements. It did have some additional cost to our team because, again, if we'd have had traffic shifted further out, we wouldn't have needed to shore for those foundations. But again, a minimal cost to help with those other improvements. And then the temporary turbine pattern, just helped eliminate some of those ramp conflicts and get that traffic pushed to the outside of the turbine ramps a little faster. And again, being able to use the crossovers allowed us to use the other bridges for the earthwork hauling. So again, a big project schedule efficiency there. The next project is U5717. It's US 15501 in Garrett Road. This is in Durham, North Carolina, kind of just outside Raleigh. You can see on the screen here the existing conditions, very congested, lots of lanes, signalized intersection. 15501 has a 6-lane approach for both directions. It's 3 through lanes, dual lefts, and a dedicated right. And Garrett Road here has 3 lanes and 4-lane approaches depending on the approach. And if you can see here where like some of the parking lots and the service roads are, when I transition to the next screen, we were building a tight diamond, essentially a grade separation 15501 going over Garrett Road, with ramps and retaining walls staying down low to access to existing Garrett Road and some widening along Garrett Road as well. You can see it's not really that much of a bigger footprint when you look at the comparison and where it's hitting the existing parking lots, where we had room to really shift traffic away and build this improvement, like you typically would for a widening job or a grade separation job. So what we had to do is figure out ways to maintain the traffic operations and the intersection, but hopefully get rid of some of those lanes. And what we ended up coming up with was a temporary U-turn or super street design, where the blue circles here away from the intersection in the middle, we looked at synchro and some traffic analysis just to get some basic justification for that, and we actually ended up getting level of service C or better for the existing intersection and the U-turn movements. So basically we used some temporary pavement to build the pavement we needed for the U-turns and the left turns downstream. That allowed us to take the existing intersection to just 3 through lanes and a dedicated right for each approach on 15501, and basically triple rights from Garrett Road for both approaches, and take those turning movements and through movements on Garrett Road downstream to the signalized U-turns. From there, we were able to shift westbound 501 traffic onto the new ramp pavement to maintain access at Garrett Road there. Again, still working in a temporary super street pattern for both directions. And that let us build the first stage of the bridge, some retaining walls, and get a lot of that pavement kind of in the middle of traffic built up high. From there, we shifted eastbound traffic onto the new bridge and used the eastbound ramps to maintain traffic to Garrett Road. Again, with traffic still merging off the screen and then going downstream to the U-turns to make those movements and come back to the main intersection. So again, the big benefits here was really just constructability. Not sure exactly what the cost and schedule impacts were, just because we really didn't get far enough to even figure out if it was constructible with the lanes that we had. We realized very early on that 6 lanes in both directions would have been massive amounts of temporary pavement and temp shoring and right-of-way costs. So it didn't go very far before we realized we had an issue. So really constructability was the main driving point here. Another project is I-3802A. This is in Kannapolis, North Carolina. It's just outside Concord, or maybe an hour north of Charlotte, North Carolina. This is an existing full clover interchange, again at US 601. And the proposed design was to construct a DDI. And you can see here, this is actually the DOT's preliminary concept, but it shows really well a lot of the conflicts between the existing loops and ramps and the proposed DDI ramps, and some of the issues or conflicts you had trying to stage construct a new interchange configuration like this. So one of the things we looked at early on was getting rid of the loops and actually constructing a temporary diamond interchange. So you can see here the orange kind of honeycomb pattern is temporary pavement that we installed. We put some pavement into the median to allow for left turns onto the ramps, and then obviously kind of realigned each of the ramps to allow the left turns at the intersection. Again, use synchro and sim traffic to look at level of service and queuing. Again, temporary conditions, so kind of more preliminary analysis or just justification there. I think we had a level of service D for one of the intersections during one peak hour, but everything else was C or better. And again, because of the benefit to constructability, we were able to get that approved through DOT and move forward. So again, you can see once that pattern opens up, you can see how much eliminating those loops allowed us to build the DDI spurs and ramps there in the middle of the intersection. And again, just a signalized left turn from US 601 and a full movement approach from the ramps coming off of I-85. And another feature that is not shown in the slides, but we actually had another step later on where traffic was actually able to get onto the new ramps, but still have some temporary pavement to tie back to this existing or this temporary diamond configuration. And that allowed us to really separate the DDI traffic shift and construction to shift 601 itself into the DDI pattern and the ramp construction itself. So that way those two items weren't tied schedule-wise. So again, just a lot of efficiency in the DDI ramp construction, getting those loops out of the way, and just overall a benefit from schedule by being able to split up the US 601 schedule from the ramp construction schedule. Again, some minor costs for temp pavements and temp signals. In the scheme of the benefits, it really wasn't a decision to move forward with this. This project's in Statesville, North Carolina. Again, it's about an hour and a half north of Charlotte on I-40 and I-77. In the picture here, I-40 is east-west, I-77 is north-south. You can see this is a I-3819B. They had an A project that came before us. Essentially, what it built is the kind of fly under, you can see, where it took away the top right loop. Then a lot of the new ramp pavement you can see in the concrete paving on the top left quadrant. But for the most part, it really just replaced that top right loop with the kind of fly under of I-77 and I-40. The DOT's design, this is their concept map drawing. The purplish blue color is all structure and the green is pavement. So you can see they had pretty large third level structures for flyovers for I-40 movements to I-77. Again, one of the things we looked at very early on was ways to reduce just the overall cost and footprint of these structures. And so overlaying our project rendering for our actual design that we got the project with, you can kind of see how much less structure design we had, or structures that we had in our design, and how smaller or more condensed the footprint of the interchange became as well by pulling those ramps in, eliminated the third level construction of the bridges, kept everything at 2 levels. So a much more efficient, cost-effective design, and again, just constructability of not trying to build 3-level bridges was a betterment as well. One thing I want to point out here too is you can see the green pavement just to the left of our rendering where the yellow arrow popped up. We actually did realign 77 to help with the bridge staging of the 77 bridges over I-40. The current, or the preliminary hearing map design had everything right on top of each other, and we would have had to widen the bridges temporarily or extra width than needed for the permanent design just to account for the constructability. So to save again on some bridge deck quantity, we actually permanently relocated 77 to help with that constructability. Another thing we did is we wanted to isolate the I-40 pavement and the I-40 improvements from I-77, again, just to enhance our construction schedule. So one of the things we actually looked at was taking I-40 under the existing I-77 bridges. You can see the street view image on the top. The red arrow there is showing the existing slope abutment for the 77 bridges. And then the bottom left plan view there has the red arrow kind of showing where traffic ended up going through that existing southbound structure. Again, what that let us do is really just not have to wait for these 77 bridges to be built and the existing demolished before we can shift I-40 traffic. So what we did is, you can see the typical section on the right, the purple line and purple arrows point to the existing bridge columns and existing sloped abutment. And we excavated that down using temporary shoring, which is the green lines there. And that let us actually take all that fill down, still support the columns and the bridge, and then build our permanent pavement, which is the red box shape there, at its final elevation. And then we just had a little bit of temporary pavement for just kind of the shoulders and the barrier to sit on up against the shoring wall. So again, that let us get I-40 traffic shifts independent of the I-77 bridges, and just really, again, a big efficiency from a schedule standpoint. So again, those are the main benefits for that excavation. Again, significant cost there actually, because you could see those shoring walls were not small. And again, some temporary pavement needed to just kind of fit some barrier and shoulder widths in there. And then again, a permanent I-77 realignment. We looked at temporary mitigation to stage those bridges, and ended up, overall being cheaper to have some additional earthwork and move 77 than to widen those bridges just for constructability. The last project I'm going to touch on is U5908. This is in Huntersville, North Carolina. The image on the right shows Main Street and NC Highway 115 are parallel streets. They meet up at the green stars, and the blue star and red star are kind of the same location on both aerials. You can see there's a really congested intersection at the red star. It's Huntersville Concord Road and NC Highway 115. There's several buildings right at the back of the sidewalk, so not a lot of room for turn lanes or your typical intersection improvements. So one of the concepts and what we ended up moving forward for the project was what you can see on the right was basically dual roundabouts at where you saw the green stars on the previous slide, where the Main Street and Highway 115 come together. And really it's just to encourage folks to use the Main Street as an alternate route through that intersection. Again, since there weren't typical methods or room to do kind of your typical widening. But one of the conflicts or challenges we ran into was the southern roundabout had some right-of-way issues where we couldn't pull it completely offline. There was a historic property in one of the quadrants, and just because of the geometry, we were forced to actually do a closure of one of the legs to finish construction of the roundabout. We were able to limit the amount of work needed where we felt a 30-day closure would be sufficient. But what we didn't want to do is have to close the Highway 115 traffic, because it's certainly the highest volume on the project and just a pretty high volume corridor in general. So what we did is actually took them in still a conventional two-way pattern through the roundabout on the side that was constructed in a previous step, and kind of just snaked them around the center island with just a typical T intersection for the one leg that stayed open on the south. We actually ran auto turn for that, and large trucks could make the movements through there, but they obviously had to encroach onto the center truck apron island. We had some safety concerns that if the trucks didn't know they needed to encroach onto that or didn't turn quite hard enough into that maybe there would be a chance for those trucks to overlap lanes. So we actually put in a truck detour for that same 30 days as the leg closure you see here, to just bypass the truck traffic as much as possible, hopefully all of them. But again, if some trucks do come through, we did have the room to make those moves. So again, the biggest benefit there was really just safety and just being able to maintain those high through volumes while improving constructability there. So with that, I will take any questions now.
Great, thank you. Yeah, great presentation. If anyone has questions for Richard, please go ahead and post them in the questions pod. I'll start with one, and you know, I haven't been involved personally in much MOT strategies. I have done a lot of work on evaluating performance measures and all that. But it's, you know, one thing that struck me in hearing all your examples is almost you kind of build an innovative design, use another innovative design to get there along the way. So the super street or RCI, and then, you know, different configurations. Do you ever, you know, along the way kind of ask yourself, well, why are we even going to the final configuration? You know, what if, you know, would the RCI on 15501 have done the trick? I mean, I guess, you know, I'm kind of curious in kind of your assessment of kind of the project life cycle, where, you know, to me, I don't think that MOT and constructability is necessarily part of the project selection or the ultimate project kind of concept development. I guess my question to you is, should it be? And is, you know, kind of that constructability and MOT, is that really something that should be done maybe much earlier before the initial concept is developed?
Yeah, I do think that different agencies have done a lot better lately of doing constructability reviews or even preparing, you know, 15-20% concept plans for MOT as they, you know, identify preferred alternatives. But yeah, it's certainly, you know, one thing that helps too is a lot of the times you're designing, you know, 20-25 years out for your permanent design. So, you know, some good traditional intersection concepts may work well for the existing year, but maybe not 20-25 years down the road for your design year. You know, again, I think that 15501 project was a good example of that. That I think if we'd have used, you know, volumes from 2040 or whatever the design year again for that project was, I can't remember, that maybe the U-turns wouldn't have worked as well, you know, there. But yeah, certainly, you know, I think that would have been a very good one for some constructability reviews, because we quickly got in there and realized that maintaining 6 lanes was going to be a challenge. Another thing that I meant to point out was we had the Durham Orange Light Rail was along that corridor as well. And at the time we were going through our design, our 25% right of way design, that was still an active project. So we were trying to avoid impacts to that as well. And I think that would have opened up some other options as well if we weren't designing around that. But yeah, certainly, yeah, sometimes it works well for construction in current design years and not necessarily as good for future years.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and if you have other questions, I would say really for any of the panelists, feel free to post them. I have one other one here. What about kind of multimodal impacts during MOT? How much are you seeing that? I know many of your projects work on freeway interchanges, pedestrians, bicyclists don't really apply as much, but for projects like Huntersville, 15501, how much are you looking at kind of pedestrian and bicyclist access during?
Yeah, we certainly we always try to make that a component if especially if there's existing facilities. DOT recently, or the last 2 years ago, maybe came out with some more I guess updated guidelines for pedestrian accommodation. So again, here in North Carolina, we have a lot more guidance or suggestions on amount of pedestrian counts, levels of need, or what you need to maintain during construction. But certainly that's definitely a factor. If you have existing sidewalk, every attempt should be maintained or should be made to maintain that. We've done that on different scenarios where, again, that U5908 would be a good example where when we did that temporary shift and had to do the detour for traffic, pedestrian facility on the east side was already built and could easily have been opened up and maintained for pedestrians during that detour. But yeah, certainly we try to keep that in mind, again, especially if there's existing facilities. And then just for typical traffic control principles, you try to only work on one side of a road at a time anyways. So even when there's not existing facilities out there, if there are pedestrians, they're hopefully already found safe ways of maneuvering along the roadway. And so by limiting your work to one side of the road, hopefully those pedestrians can still use the shoulders in the areas they were using existing.
Okay, great, thank you. So we have a couple more minutes for any other questions. There was a question that we didn't get to with the earlier one. How does your grocery store question apply to the small discount store, Dollar General? And I think we had gotten the answer that it's similar to a small grocery store or Walgreens drugstore type of business.
You want me to take?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Sure. Yeah, I think typically, we've kind of set a threshold of 50,000 square feet as being the kind of this teetering point between regional and local. But there's also there is a little bit of this, the agencies typically retain the ability to say, okay, well, this land use does, even though it may fit our typical profile, we're still going to take a step back and ask more just based on the characteristics of it. But based on the base of that, I would probably say that's local serving, that it's primarily a grocery store function.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, well, we're right at the end. Thank you, Richard, and again to all the other presenters. Thank you to the audience for your questions and attendance. And yeah, that puts us at the end of the session. So, thank you.